It began with a calm lake, a quiet neighborhood, and a family who only wanted peace. But peace never lasts when power and greed collide. One day the HOA made a decision so bold, so outrageous, it shook the entire community. They claimed the water, the land around it, and even the rights of those who lived closest to it. What followed was not just a disagreement, but a battle of control, money, and revenge. A fight that would expose just how far an HOA is willing to go, and how far one homeowner would go to take everything back. Would anyone survive the fallout? Jake and Maria had chosen the lakefront home for one. Reason above all others, peace. The mornings were quiet, the water still and silver under the sunrise, and their 2 children could run barefoot through the grass, without the roar of traffic or the constant buzz of city life. It was the kind of place most people only dreamed about. They had worked for years to make it theirs, planting flowers along the edges of the yard, fixing the old dock that stretched out into the lake, and building memories in a space that felt safe. The community itself looked perfect on the surface. Neatly trimmed lawns, smiling neighbors who waved as they drove by, and the promise of safety within the walls of an HOA-run neighborhood. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a small paradise, but those who lived inside its gates knew the truth. Every rule, every guideline, and every whisper of disapproval carried weight. The HOA board wasn't just a group of volunteers. They were watchers, critics, and enforcers. At first, Jake and Maria didn't pay much attention to it. They followed the rules, kept their yard tidy, and stayed out of trouble. But over time, subtle hints began to appear. Notices slipped into mailboxes, reminders about community standards, quiet conversations at meetings that didn't include everyone. There was a sense that something was being planned, something larger than ordinary neighborhood disputes. And then the lake itself became the focus. It was more than water. It was the heart of the community. Children played in it, families fished from it, and neighbors gathered around it. Jake had always believed the lake belonged to everyone equally. But soon he would discover that the HOA saw it differently, very differently. Would their peaceful life survive what was about to happen? Or had the seeds of conflict already been planted without them even realizing it? The first letter arrived on a Thursday morning, folded neatly and stamped with the HOA's seal. Jake thought nothing of it until he opened the envelope. Inside was a notice, blunt and cold, stating that his dock was in violation of community standards. Too old, too weathered, too dangerous, the board claimed. He had 30 days to remove it or face escalating fines. Jake stared at the words, baffled. That dock wasn't just wood and nails. It was where his kids fished on weekends, where Maria liked to sit at sunset, and where they had poured hours of work to repair it when they first moved in. To tear it down felt like tearing away part of their home. Maria tried to calm him, suggesting they speak with the board. Surely this was just a misunderstanding. But when they brought it up at the next HOA meeting, the reception was icy. The board members sat at a long table, faces expressionless, voices clipped. They insisted the dock was unsafe, that it did not meet aesthetic standards. When Jake asked to see the exact rule being broken, the chairman only smirked. Rules aren't always black and white, he said, and that's why the board has discretion. It was the first real glimpse of what they were dealing with. The fines started next. $50 for the dock, another $100 for yard maintenance, because Maria's flower beds were apparently too overgrown. When Jake repainted the dock instead of tearing it down, the board responded with another letter. Now the paint color wasn't community approved. Each time the fines stacked higher. Neighbors whispered about it, but few spoke openly. Everyone knew what it meant to cross the board. Stories circulated quietly, of families who sold their homes in frustration, of people who lost thousands in penalties, of reputations dragged through the mud until they broke. Jake and Maria were not the type to back down easily. They kept fighting, sending letters, asking for evidence, demanding meetings. But the board always had an answer, always a loophole, always a way to twist the rules just enough to trap them again. Then came the proposal that made everything worse. At the next community meeting, the HOA unveiled their plan. A floating restaurant built right on the lake. It would be the pride of the neighborhood, they said, drawing attention, raising property values, and putting their community on the map. But not everyone saw it that way. Jake certainly didn't. He knew what it meant for the water quality, for the wildlife, for the peace they had built their lives around. He stood up, his voice steady but fierce, and argued against it. The lake was shared property, a natural space meant for the community, not a commercial venture. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. The chairman leaned forward, his expression sharp. "If you don't like progress," he said, "perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." From that moment, the fight became personal. The HOA doubled their efforts, issuing fines for the smallest things. A garden hose left uncoiled, a trash bin pulled to the curb too early, even the color of Maria's curtains. Each notice was like a stone thrown at their home, small but relentless, meant to break them down piece by piece. Maria began to feel the weight of it. She stopped gardening, afraid her flowers would trigger another complaint. The children asked why their parents were always angry, why people in the neighborhood looked at them differently. Even friends began to keep their distance, unwilling to get caught in the storm. Still, Jake pressed forward. He gathered documents, photographs, records of every letter and fine. He spoke with other neighbors, carefully, quietly, until he realized something shocking. He wasn't alone. Others had been targeted before, though most gave up or left. The board thrived on fear, and Jake's defiance was unusual. Then one night, another letter arrived, but this one was different. It wasn't about fines or rules. It was a warning. A neighbor slipped it into his hand discreetly, their eyes darting nervously. The message was simple. They will push until you break. Be careful. Jake sat at the kitchen table with Maria, the paper trembling between them. It wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, about control. The pressure mounted as construction on the restaurant began. Heavy machinery rolled to the lake's edge, tearing into the shoreline where children once played. Jake watched from his porch, fists clenched, while Maria stood silently beside him. It felt like the community they loved was being ripped apart before their eyes. The HOA called it progress. Jake called it destruction. At the next meeting, tensions boiled over. Jake brought his evidence, letters, fines, photos of the lake, testimony from other neighbors. He laid it all before the board, his voice echoing through the hall. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others watching in fear. But the chairman only smiled thinly and replied, "You can collect all the papers you want. In the end, the board makes the rules." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For a moment, Jake felt the weight of hopelessness press against him. But then he saw it, Maria's eyes steady and determined, locking onto his. She would not let him give up. The rising conflict had reached its peak. The HOA thought they had cornered him, crushed him under rules and fines. But Jake had something they didn't expect. He had resolve. He had truth. And most of all, he had nothing left to lose. The real battle was about to begin. Would he find a way to turn their own power against them? Or would the board finally break him as they had so many others? The answer was coming. And when it did, no one in that community would ever forget it. The night of the community meeting felt different. For weeks, tension had hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud. But now it was about to break. Cars lined the street in front of the clubhouse, headlights sweeping across the manicured lawns as neighbors filed inside. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, low voices and nervous glances. Inside, the board sat at their long table as always. papers neatly stacked, expressions carefully neutral. But there was something smug in their posture, as though they believed this meeting would be just another chance to remind everyone who held the power. Jake and Maria sat near the front. Their stack of binders and folders looked almost absurd against the board's polished setup. Yet every page, every document was a weapon. Weeks of fines, letters, bylaws, and photographs, all the evidence of the board's campaign against them. The chairman cleared his throat, tapping his gavel. "Order! Tonight, we address the ongoing concerns regarding the waterfront property improvements and community compliance." His voice carried the confidence of a man who thought he had already won. But Jake rose before the chairman could continue. He wasn't the type to command a room with words. But tonight something different burned in his voice. "Before we begin," he said, his tone steady, "I have something the community deserves to see." He lifted a binder, flipping it open, then spread copies across the nearest table. Neighbors leaned forward, curious, whispering as the papers passed from hand to hand. Photos of the dock, letters with dates and signatures, notices of fines so trivial they seemed ridiculous. $50 for an uncoiled hose, $100 for Maria's flower beds, $200 for repainting. The dock in a shade of brown, only slightly different from approved taupe. The audience stirred. Some frowned, others shook their heads. The evidence spoke louder than any speech could. The chairman leaned back in his chair, unfazed. "Homeowners must abide by the rules," he said coldly. "The documents only prove we've been diligent in enforcing them." But Jake wasn't finished. He pulled out another folder and held it high. "This," he said, "isn't about rules. This is about abuse of power." He laid out minutes from past meetings, showing the restaurant project had been in discussion, long before any letters about his dock appeared. He produced emails, obtained through neighbors, hinting that resistant homeowners needed to be dealt with swiftly to avoid interference. Gasps rippled through the room. The board shifted uneasily. The mask of calm control began to crack. Then Jake delivered the bombshell. From his final folder, he pulled copies of financial records he had obtained through legal requests. Line items stood out in stark black and white. Community funds redirected to contractors, tied to board members. Payments approved without disclosure. Thousands spent under vague descriptions, like consulting and expedited services. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted, demanded explanations, turned on the board with anger that had simmered too long in silence. For the first time, the board's control slipped. The chairman slammed his gavel. "Order! Sit down!" His voice cracked, losing its iron grip. "This is out of line." But Jake stepped forward, slamming the binder shut with a sound that cut through the chaos. "What's out of line?" he said, his voice ringing with fury. "Is stealing from the very people you claim to represent. What's out of line is terrorizing families with fake rules while you funnel money into your own pockets. And what's out of line is thinking no one would ever stand up to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Maria stood then, her voice softer but sharper than steel. "We moved here for peace, for community, not to be bullied, not to be threatened, and not to watch our neighborhood destroyed by greed." Neighbors rose one by one. A man at the back shouted, "I got the same fines for my lawn." Another woman cried out, "You drained our funds for your pet project." The room tipped, the balance of power shifting with every voice that joined the outcry. The chairman pounded his gavel again, his face red with anger. But no one listened. The authority he had wielded like a weapon had dissolved in the flood of truth. Finally, Jake delivered the killing blow. He pulled out one last letter, sealed and stamped, not from the HOA, but from the county clerk's office. He had filed a formal complaint. The board was now under investigation for financial misconduct. The board members froze. The smug confidence drained from their faces. The chairman opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in months, Jake felt the crushing weight on his chest lift. He looked out over the crowd, not at enemies, not at silent bystanders, but at neighbors who had found their voices again. The board's reign of fear had shattered, but even as the crowd roared with anger and vindication, Jake knew this wasn't the end. Investigations took time. Power didn't crumble overnight, and people this corrupt would fight to the very last breath. As the meeting descended into chaos, with board members shouting, neighbors demanding resignations, and the gavel pounding helplessly against the noise, Jake leaned close to Maria. "They're cornered now," he whispered. "That's when they're most dangerous." Maria nodded, her hand gripping his. The war wasn't over, but tonight, for the first time, they had struck back, and the board knew it. The climax had come and gone, but what lingered in the air was more than victory. It was the promise of a reckoning still to come, and as the crowd surged forward, demanding answers, one question burned brighter than ever. Would justice finally be served, or would the board find a way to claw back their power in one last desperate move? The weeks after that meeting were like living in a storm's aftermath. The air felt clearer, yes, but the debris of conflict still lay scattered everywhere. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with Jake and Maria now walked up their driveway to shake their hands, offering baked goods, pats on the back, or simple words of gratitude. Yet behind every smile was a question they dared not ask out loud. What happens next? The answer came quickly. Within days, official letters circulated. Several board members had resigned, their names scribbled at the bottom of hasty notes mailed to the entire community. The chairman, however, clung stubbornly to his seat, insisting he had done nothing wrong. His allies muttered about witch hunts and personal vendettas, but their voices sounded smaller, weaker than before. The spell of fear had been broken. Soon after, county officials arrived, clipboards in hand, quietly walking the property lines, snapping photos, speaking to homeowners. The whispers spread like wildfire. Subpoenas had been issued, bank accounts frozen, an audit underway. Suddenly, the very people who once acted untouchable found themselves hiding behind closed blinds. And in that silence, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had lived side by side for years, but had barely spoken, started gathering on lawns and porches, sharing stories. They compared letters, fines, and threats, realizing just how many of them had been targeted. What once felt like isolated harassment now appeared as part of a much bigger scheme. It was as if everyone had been holding fragments of a puzzle, and only now, together, could they see the whole picture. Jake and Maria watched it unfold with quiet relief. For months they had carried the weight of the fight alone, two voices shouting against a wall of power. Now those voices had multiplied into dozens, then hundreds. The community had awoken. The restaurant, project, the gleaming, floating centerpiece that had started it all, was abandoned. Work crews packed up, their equipment hauled away under pressure from the investigation. The half-finished structure stood like a skeleton over the lake, a monument to greed, its empty frame swaying in the wind. Some said it should be torn down immediately. Others argued to finish it properly and use it for community good. In the end, the county ruled it unsafe. Demolition crews arrived one morning, and by sundown the lake was free again, reflecting only the sky and the trees on its calm surface. The sound of that demolition carried through the neighborhood like a final exhale. Neighbors gathered along the shore, watching as each beam and panel came down, some cheering, some simply standing in silence. For Jake and Maria it was bittersweet. They had loved their dog, their quiet mornings on the water, their simple peace. But that peace had been stolen, long before the restaurant ever rose. Watching it fall felt less like victory, and more like the closing of a painful chapter. Still, victories came in other forms. The county's audit uncovered tens of thousands of dollars misused by the board. Kickbacks, undisclosed contracts, personal expenses charged to community funds. The findings were damning. Criminal charges followed, the kind that no amount of smooth talking could erase. The chairman who had once ruled with arrogance was now reduced to a defendant, shuffling through courtrooms, his name whispered in shame rather than fear. A new election was called. This time, instead of running unopposed, board positions were filled by neighbors eager to rebuild trust. Retirees, young families, long-time residents, ordinary people stepped forward, determined not to let power fall into the wrong hands again. Transparency became the new word on everyone's lips. Meetings were recorded, finances posted publicly, and decisions debated in the open. The HOA, once a shadowy weapon, slowly transformed into what it should have been all along. A service, not a throne. For Jake and Maria, life began to return to something resembling normal. They rebuilt their dock with the proper permits this time, though no one dared challenge them anymore. The flower beds bloomed again, bright and defiant. On quiet evenings they sat by the water, listening to the hum of crickets and the gentle splash of fish beneath the surface, finally able to breathe without looking over their shoulders. But the fight had left its mark. They carried scars, not the kind you see on skin, but the kind that linger in the soul. Nights when Maria would wake from dreams of letters stuffed under their door. Days when Jake would tense at the sight of an unfamiliar car slowing near their driveway. Victory doesn't erase the memory of battle. It only makes it bearable. And yet, something else had taken root too. Strength. A sense of resilience they hadn't known they possessed. When they looked at their neighbors, they no longer saw strangers, but allies forged in shared struggle. The bonds formed in conflict proved stronger than the fences that once divided them. Years later, when people spoke of the floating restaurant fiasco, they didn't just talk about corruption or greed. They spoke about the moment the community stood up, about the day the silence broke, about how one family's refusal to bow changed the course of an entire neighborhood. Old men on porches told the story with a shake of the head and a chuckle, how the board thought they could bully their way to power and ended up collapsing under their own arrogance. Parents pointed to the lake and told their children how it was almost stolen, but saved because someone dared to say enough. And for Jake and Maria, though they never sought recognition, there was a quiet pride in knowing they had sparked something larger than themselves. Their fight had not just been about fines or docks, or even the lake. It had been about dignity, about refusing to be trampled by those who mistook control for leadership. In the end, the greatest impact wasn't the fall of a corrupt board, or the demolition of a restaurant, or even the restoration of peace. It was the lesson burned into the heart of the community that silence enables abuse, but unity dismantles it. That ordinary people, when they stand together, can topple even the most entrenched power. And so the story became a kind of legend in that neighborhood, a cautionary tale for anyone who thought of using fear to govern, a reminder for future boards that their duty was not to rule, but to serve. As the old man telling this tale leaned back in his chair, his voice softened. That's how it ended, you see. Not with fireworks or parades, but with something far more powerful. With neighbors learning to trust each other again. With a community remembering what it meant to be one. And with a family who simply refused to bend, no matter how strong the storm blew. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, then added quietly, "And that's the thing about power. It only lasts as long as people let it. Once they stand, once they speak, no gavel, no threat, no rulebook can silence them again."